All right, let's get right into it. If you're into true crime, and I know you are, you love unsolved mysteries, the ones that keep you up at night, then you're in the right place. We are going deep on the story of the Frankfurt Slasher.
Ooh, that's a creepy one.
It is, right? From 1985 to 1990, this possible, maybe likely, serial killer had the Frankfurt neighborhood in Philadelphia living in fear. And it's a case, well, we've got a lot to dig into. We've got police reports, we've got witness testimonies,
These were transcripts too.
court transcripts, the whole shebang. We are going to try to figure out what exactly happened, or at least get as close as we can.
Hmm.
And the thing that really gets me about this case, one man was actually convicted for one of the murders, but get this, the others, they're still unsolved. And there was another murder, super similar, that happened even after the convicted man was already in prison.
Yeah, how does that happen?
So was it the wrong guy? Was there a copycat out there? Let's try to untangle this.
It's one of those situations where you really have way more questions than answers. And I think it shows how difficult criminal investigations can sometimes be. I mean, you think with multiple murders that look like they were done by the same person, catching the killer would be like a slam dunk. But the Frankfurt Slasher case, man, it just throws everything you think you know out the window.
It really does. You'd think it'd be an open and shut case, but the deeper we go, it seems like it gets even more confusing.
Yeah, you're telling me.
Let's back up for a second and start with, laying out the timeline. Who are the victims here?
Okay, so between August of 85 and September of 90, we've got 9 murders that might be connected, might be related.
9.
Yeah.
I thought it was 8.
Well, that's where it gets kind of tricky, see. The first 8, they're pretty much considered to be linked, for sure.
Mhm.
We've got Helen Patton, Anna Carroll, Susanna Olzef, Jean Durkin, Margaret Vaughn, Teresa Ciortino, Carol Dowd, and Michelle Diener.
Okay.
But then you've got this 9th one, Catherine Jones. She was murdered in January of 87. But whether she fits in with the rest is, well, it's debated.
Okay, so 9 possible victims, 5 years. What else do we know? What do they have in common?
All women. They were all sexually assaulted and all stabbed to death, too. And here's another wrinkle. Multiple witnesses said that they saw some of the victims with this middle-aged white guy right before they turned up dead.
That's going to be important later.
Right.
Because that comes back when Leonard Christopher comes into the picture.
Right.
He was convicted for Carol Dowd's murder back in 1990. But the thing is, Christopher didn't look anything like the guy the witnesses said they saw. He's a black man in his 20s, not a middle-aged white guy.
No, not at all. And to make it even weirder, there was zero, I mean literally zero physical evidence connecting Christopher to any of the crime scenes. Not even Dowd's, the one he was convicted for.
Well, yeah.
I'm talking no DNA, no fingerprints, nothing. They built the case on circumstantial evidence.
But what does that even mean, circumstantial evidence? For those of us who aren't, lawyers or judges, what does that mean?
It means they built their case against Christopher by putting together a bunch of facts and events that seem to suggest but don't actually prove that he was guilty. Like, for instance, he worked at a fish market that was pretty close to where Dowd was killed.
Okay.
And he had some convictions, assault charges in the past, though nothing for murder.
So they're basically saying, hey, he was in the neighborhood, and he has been known to be violent before, so it must have been him.
Basically, yeah, that's the gist of it. But just because you happen to be near a crime scene and you maybe got into a fight one time doesn't mean you're suddenly a murderer. No physical evidence, the description doesn't match. It makes you wonder if they got the right guy.
It makes you wonder, for sure.
Yeah.
So if we say, just for a second, that Christopher wasn't the guy, that he was innocent, well, that means the real Frankfurt Slasher, he's out there killing someone else, while the cops, they're busy focusing on the wrong person.
Right, exactly. And that makes you think, did they mess up the investigation? Did they waste a bunch of time and resources going after Christopher when they should have been looking somewhere else?
And even if Christopher was guilty, we still have this copycat running around doing basically the same thing. Either way, something's not adding up here.
Yeah. The Diener murder really changes things. Was it really just some random copycat? Or did they miss something, some link between the murders that they just didn't see?
Or worse, did they actually put the wrong guy away?
It's possible, and that's what makes this whole case so frustrating.
You know what I don't get? They just accepted that copycat idea so quickly. Wouldn't they have, looked into Diener's murder with the same energy as the others?
You'd think, right?
Especially with how much they looked alike. You'd think they want to be extra careful and make sure they weren't making the same mistakes again.
You would think. But it feels like once they got that guilty verdict for Christopher, they kind of felt like, okay, case closed. Like they just wanted an easy answer, a way to wrap it all up.
And calling it a copycat, that let them do that.
Yeah.
But it's like they got so focused on Christopher, they couldn't see anything else.
It's what they call tunnel vision. You see it in criminal investigations sometimes. It's like you get so locked in on one suspect, one theory, that you miss anything that doesn't fit with what you already believe.
So in this case, they get it in their heads that Christopher's the guy, and they ignore all the things that don't make sense. They ignore the witnesses who said he doesn't look like the killer. They ignore the fact that there's no physical evidence.
Exactly.
And that leads to someone being convicted who maybe shouldn't have been.
It happens more often than you'd think.
Let's go back to the trial, though. Back to Christopher.
Yeah.
You said there wasn't any physical evidence linking him to Carol Dowd. So how did they even try to make a case against him?
They used what they call circumstantial evidence. They talked about how Christopher worked near where Dowd was found, and they brought up his past convictions, even though they weren't for murder. They tried to make him look like a violent person. They also focused on any little inconsistencies in the witness statements, like, maybe people misremembered things, maybe they were scared, maybe it was dark.
So they're basically creating a story, even though they don't have the proof.
Pretty much. And when it came to those descriptions from the witnesses, the ones that didn't match Christopher at all, well, they just said maybe they were wrong about the guy's race. It was dark, it was stressful, memory's not perfect.
That's a stretch.
Yeah. They also kept bringing up those past convictions, trying to show a pattern of behavior. Like, see, he's done this kind of thing before.
But the jury, how did they find him guilty? With all that uncertainty, all those things that didn't add up.
Tough to say for sure. You never really know what happens in that jury room. But maybe the story the prosecution told, plus the fact that these were really awful crimes, and the pressure to put someone away, maybe that all swayed them. Beyond a reasonable doubt doesn't mean there can't be any doubt at all.
It makes you think about how, even though the justice system is supposed to be fair, mistakes can happen. And in this case, the mistakes, they could have put an innocent man in prison.
It's true. The lack of physical evidence, the descriptions that didn't match, and then that copycat murder on top of it all points to a wrongful conviction. And that raises all these questions about who's responsible, about how good our forensic science really is, about what justice really even means.
It's a lot to think about. So, did they ever reopen the investigation after Christopher was in prison and Diener was killed? Did they ever think, hey, maybe we got this wrong?
From what I've seen, not really. It seems like the police, they were convinced they had their guy, and that was that. They closed the case, even with all those unanswered questions.
So did the Frankford Slasher just disappear? Did they stop killing? Are there maybe even more victims we don't know about?
That's what's so scary, isn't it? We don't know. The information we have, it focuses on those years, 85 to 90. There's not much about anything that came after.
It's creepy thinking there might be more to the story.
It is. And it shows that even when a case seems solved, that doesn't mean we know the whole truth. There's always something more to uncover, always another side to the story, always more questions to ask.
It's like a puzzle where we're missing pieces, and we don't even know what the picture's supposed to look like.
A puzzle is a good way to put it. And this one, it might never be solved completely. But that doesn't mean we should stop trying to figure it out.
What about the people who lived in Frankfurt? They went through all this, years of being afraid. Did Christopher's conviction give them any peace?
It's easy to forget about that part, The Frankford Slasher case, it wasn't just about clues and evidence and courtrooms. It was about real people, a whole community living through something terrifying. Think about it. Women being murdered, no one knowing who's doing it. It would make you afraid to leave your house.
Right.
And yeah, maybe when Christopher was convicted, they felt a little bit safer. But without knowing for sure, without knowing if there was someone else out there, I bet that fear, it never really went away.
Imagine the stress, the grief, all those unanswered questions. It must have been hard to move on.
It would have been. These cases, they aren't just puzzles. They're about real people's lives. They're about loss. They're about a whole community trying to heal.
Makes you think. Adds another layer to an already complicated story.
For sure. And it shows how important it is to be sensitive, to remember that these cases are about real people who suffered. It's not just about catching the bad guy. It's about getting justice for the victims, their families, and the whole community.
So where do we go from here? What can we learn from the Frankford Slasher case? What does it tell us about the justice system, about investigations, about the truth itself?
I think the biggest lesson here is don't be afraid to ask questions, to be skeptical. Don't just accept what you're told, even if it sounds right. Look for the things that don't fit, the missing pieces, the other possibilities, because sometimes the most obvious answer, it's not the right one. And to get to the truth, sometimes you got to look in the places that make you uncomfortable.
That's a good point. Wanting to have an answer to close the case, it can't stop us from looking at all the angles.
Exactly. And even in cases where we might never know everything, just trying to find those answers, demanding that someone be held accountable, that's a big part of what justice means.
We've been through a lot with this deep dive. So many twists and turns, so many questions that are still unanswered. But I think it's important to look at these complicated cases. They make us think about the justice system and how we decide if something's true or not.
Yeah, and this case in particular, with all the mystery surrounding it, it really gets you thinking. What does justice really mean? Is it about punishing someone, even if you're not totally sure they did it? Or is it about finding the truth, no matter what?
That's the big question, isn't it? With the Frankfurt Slasher, we might never know if an innocent man was convicted or if the real killer is still out there.
It's hard to accept, and it shows how the justice system, even though it tries to be fair, it's still run by people, and people make mistakes. People have biases. The Frankfurt Slasher case reminds us that finding justice, it's not always about finding a perfect answer. Sometimes it's about admitting that we don't know everything and that some questions, well, they might never get answered.
That's a powerful thought. And I think it's something for everyone to think about, not just when we're talking about true crime, but in our lives too. We're always getting new information, and it's easy to jump to conclusions, to go with the easiest explanation. But this case, it reminds us to dig deeper, to question what we think we know, and to be open to the fact that things might be more complicated than they look.
Right on. We can't let our need for an answer stop us from finding the truth. And even when we don't have all the pieces, just trying to find them, demanding that someone be held responsible, that's what matters.
So what's the one thing you hope our listeners take away from all this? What's the most important thing you want them to remember about the Frankfurt Slasher?
Don't be afraid to question things. Question the stories people tell you. Question the evidence. Question your own assumptions. Real justice means being critical, being willing to deal with the messy stuff.
Well said. And to everyone listening, we hope you keep digging into this case and others like it. Keep learning, keep asking questions. The truth is out there, and it's up to all of us to find it. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.
And remember, sometimes the mysteries that are never solved, those are the ones that really make you think.
It's true. And those unanswered questions, sometimes those are the ones that stay with you the longest. With this case, it's not just about who the Frankfurt Slasher was, or if Leonard Christopher was innocent. It's about the people, the real people, whose lives were changed forever because of these crimes.
Yeah, you can't forget about the families of the victims, the people who never got any closure. And the whole community, they lived in fear for years. This case shows how these things have consequences that last a long time, way beyond the news stories and the headlines.
I was just thinking about that when we were talking about the copycat idea. What if Christopher was innocent, like we were saying? That means the real killer is still out there, maybe even still doing these horrible things. And even if the copycat did kill Diener, that doesn't mean the first one just disappeared, you know?
Right, exactly. So maybe they got so focused on Christopher that the real Frankfurt Slasher slipped through the cracks. Did they even bother looking for anyone else once they thought they had their guy? Did they miss chances to connect other unsolved crimes?
And what if Christopher was guilty? That means someone else was out there copying him almost perfectly. How do you even learn to do that? Was it someone who knew Christopher or someone who read about the case and thought, I can do that too?
Chilling, isn't it? It just shows how hard it is to predict who's going to commit a crime and how easy it is for someone to copy what they've seen or heard.
You know what keeps bugging me? There's no physical evidence. None. How much has forensics changed since back then? The late 80s, early 90s. Could they do something now, like DNA testing, that could help solve this case?
Oh, absolutely. Forensic science, especially DNA analysis, it's like night and day compared to back then. It's totally changed the game. If they still have any evidence from those crime scenes, they might be able to find something now that they couldn't back then.
So there's still a chance, even though it's a cold case. Maybe technology can give us some answers.
Never say never. There's always hope. Cold cases are being solved all the time thanks to new technology. Maybe someday we'll know for sure what happened with the Frankfurt Slasher.
I know we don't have all the information, but just from what you've learned, what do you think? Do you think Christopher was innocent? Was there a copycat? Or maybe even more than one killer?
It's really tough to say. I mean, there's no physical evidence tying Christopher to any of the murders, and those witness descriptions, they don't match up either. And then you've got Michelle Dahner's murder, which throws another wrench into the whole thing. Maybe it was a copycat, or maybe the investigators just didn't understand how big this whole thing really was. But honestly, with what we have, it's impossible to say for sure if Christopher did it or if he was wrongly accused. And we may never know the whole truth about the Frankfurt Slasher.
So even after all this, the mystery continues.
It does. And I think that's what makes this case so fascinating and so scary. It shows that even with all our fancy technology and investigation techniques, some things, they just stay hidden.
It makes you realize how much we don't know, and it makes you appreciate how hard people are working to solve these cold cases, to get justice for the victims.
It really does. The Frankfurt Slasher case, it reminds us that justice isn't always about easy answers. It's about constantly searching for the truth. And sometimes, the best we can do is accept that there are things we might never know.
That's something to think about. This deep dive, it's been a look into a dark part of Philadelphia's history. We've gone through the timeline of the Frankfurt Slasher, the problems with Leonard Christopher's conviction, and the possibility that there was a copycat, or even more victims we don't know about. It's a story that leaves us with more questions than answers, but it also makes you think about how fragile justice can be and how important it is to never give up on an investigation.
Yeah, it makes you realize that even in today's world, there are some truths that might stay buried forever.
This case really shows how complex the justice system is and how much these unsolved crimes affect people's lives. To all our listeners, we hope this deep dive has gotten you thinking about these things. Keep learning about this case and others like it. Question what you hear, and never forget that real people are at the heart of these stories. Stay curious, stay informed, and remember, sometimes the most interesting mysteries are the ones we never solve.
The ones that make you keep searching, keep wondering.
Exactly. And that's what keeps us coming back to these stories week after week. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive. We'll see you next time.